Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence event series, brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Erik Dahl discussing lessons in strategic warnings from 9/11 and January 6th. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MS in Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Michael Ard.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Excited to have Erik Dahl with us to talk about intelligence failure in the events of January 6, 2021. Let me give you a little introduction on Dr. Dahl. He's an associate professor of national security affairs at the Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and the author of Intelligence and Surprise Attack, Failure and Success from Pearl Harbor to 9/11 and Beyond, and the COVID-19 intelligence failure, Why Warning Was Not Enough. This is forthcoming. Dr. Dahl retired from the Navy in 2002 after serving 21 years as an intelligence officer and received his Ph.D. from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. He is a former chair of the Intelligence Studies section of the International Studies Association. Welcome, Erik. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So I think you have some slides for us today, and then we'll have and as usual, folks, we're going to have a Q&A with our guest, and then we'll open it up to your questions, which you can use in the Q&A function or the chat.
Great. Let me go ahead and start sharing my slides. You able to see those?
Yes, plus the desktop, though, if you...
I don't want that. Hold on a second. May have the wrong. Let me look here. Let me see if this is. How is that?
That looks good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks again for having me, Michael, and thanks for everybody for being here. Really looking forward to talking with everyone, and especially the Q&A and getting your questions. But let me just first kind of set the scene, talk a little bit about what I see are some of the lessons in intelligence and strategic warning, in particular from 9/11, maybe from 9/11 until January 6th, and we'll maybe generate some questions and discussion that way here. So let me go ahead and talk about a few things. First of all, of course, for January 6th, we're having a national discussion, a national debate about what to call it. Was it a riot? Is it an act of terrorism? Was it a coup attempt, an insurrection? All these things are important, and some of these things are being discussed with the January 6th hearings in the House committee. But what I'd like to talk about, and what we're going to be talking about today, is about the intelligence aspects of January 6th. And at least so far, I haven't seen that has come up very much in the January 6th, in the House committee hearing. So I think this is really something that needs more discussion like we're having today. I'm going to argue that this was a failure of intelligence and warning. And that failure has a lot of similarities with past failures such as 9/11, or we can even go back as far as Pearl Harbor, or even more recently, Michael, you mentioned that I've got a new book that'll come out this winter, later this year, on intelligence and warning and the pandemic. And we can see similar problems at work in all these cases here. But before we talk, and before I sort of make my argument for why I would call January 6th an intelligence failure, let me just briefly touch on a couple of the different really important lessons that we have learned about intelligence from January 6th. The first is that we've learned an awful lot about the inner workings of the intelligence system, and in particular, our domestic intelligence system, which is an area, a part of the intelligence process that has been, of course, so important ever since 9/11, but I think still most Americans don't really know much about it. We're more familiar, at least we're more used to seeing articles and movies and books about the CIA or the NSA or something like that. But these sorts of domestic intelligence surveillance systems, collection systems, counterterrorism systems that tend to affect us more than those sort of big picture international intelligence programs. These are things we don't know as much about. So I think it's a good thing that we have learned a lot more, and we'll talk about a lot of those issues and lessons learned in this discussion, I hope, because intelligence is an important part of government, an important part of society, and it's more a part of our public debate today than it ever was before. I think that's a good thing, as long as we're not causing problems for our own security by revealing things that shouldn't be revealed. But there's a problem because, unfortunately, we usually have to wait for a disaster, a failure, or something bad to happen before Americans turn their focus to looking at intelligence. We shouldn't have to have a 9/11 happen before we learn an awful lot about the intelligence system through reports like the 9/11 Commission report. And we certainly shouldn't have had to wait for January 6th to happen before we have discussions like we're having right now. We learned an awful lot also about the actual sort of ways that our domestic surveillance system works. And I hope we'll talk more about that in the Q&A here. We've learned an awful lot, for instance, from the way the FBI has taken the problem on of prosecuting, of tracking down people who had invaded the Capitol here. We can talk more about that, but there are certainly important lessons here and balances for civil liberties versus security. But many of the tools that the FBI has used to determine just who was in the Capitol, and some are very familiar, just facial recognition, but some are not as much. Perhaps we can talk more about that later. One of the, I think, most interesting lessons that we all have learned after January 6th was just how many agencies, departments, and organizations were involved in tracking possible threats to the U.S. Capitol. Certainly a lot of those are very familiar: FBI, DHS, and its main intelligence organization, Intelligence and Analysis, or what we call INA. Others we know a lot about, but we probably don't know much about the Secret Service, for instance, intelligence function. So we've seen now some of the reports the Secret Service was putting out before January 6th. Other organizations that we may not have known existed. The Capitol Police Force itself, I think most of the country didn't realize that the U.S. Capitol had its own major police force, larger than most police forces in the United States, and it had its own intelligence branch. In fact, part of the problem appears to have been it had several different intelligence organizations within the Capitol Police Force. But other organizations that probably we've never heard of. The U.S. Postal Service has its own intelligence organization, if you will, the Postal Inspection Service. And they were reporting on potential threats to January 6th. The Federal Protective Service, which protects federal facilities and buildings. Even the Park Police, the U.S. National Park Police, has its own intelligence organization. And they were also, like so many of these other organizations, they were tracking threats such as on social media and many others as well. I think one of the most surprising, though, findings was that some agencies that were closest to the problem, we might say, such as the Capitol Police and the Capitol Police Intelligence organizations, those organizations in many cases weren't as perceptive. They weren't as leaning forward to understand and take on the problem that became January 6th. They weren't as aggressive about these problems as were organizations and analysts that were farther away from the problem. One example, for instance, I think most of us have probably heard of the fact that the FBI's Norfolk, Virginia office put out a report on January 5th. They were talking about in that report much of what many other organizations were seeing, warnings in social media about calls for violence the next day on January 6th. And as we learned, that report didn't get a lot of traction. And part of the reason appears to be that some of those organizations closest to the problem, in some cases physically closest, such as the Capitol Police Intelligence Organization, they were much more sanguine. They weren't as concerned about these problems, such as a Capitol Police intelligence report, their daily intelligence summary, on the same day, January 5th, which rated the chance of a major disruption on January 6th as highly improbable. Maybe we can talk about that later too, but I think that's in some ways actually a problem, a syndrome that we've seen in other cases, even in 9/11, for instance, where we learned after 9/11 that organizations that you would really have expected would be focused on potential threats and the use of aviation in terrorist attacks, like the Federal Aviation Administration, even the FAA leadership wasn't very interested when they were given reports, intelligence reports before 9/11 about the possibility of terrorists using airplanes. What's going on here? Maybe worth more talking about. But what about this argument that I make that it was an intelligence failure? And Michael, you and some of the folks on the call may have seen, I've published a timeline of the intelligence warnings before January 6th, and some of my comments here are derived from that. I should also say, maybe I should have mentioned it before, even though I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School out here in Monterey, California, all these comments are, of course, just my own personal comments. But what about this argument that January 6th was an intelligence failure? A number of experts who I think are worth listening to agree with me and say, yes, there was an intelligence failure here. Charles Allen, for instance, Charlie Allen has been one of the most famous intelligence analysts in recent US history. He was one of the first chiefs of the DHS intelligence organization some years ago. And he has written since January 6th that both the FBI and DHS, those are our two main organizations with domestic intelligence responsibilities, they both failed in their most fundamental responsibility of providing analysis and predictive warning of bad things to happen. A similar argument made by Frank Taylor, another former intelligence chief for DHS. He said he can't explain why none of these organizations, and certainly neither FBI nor DHS, put everything together and put together an analytic product that sort of summarized, hey, this is what we see. Sort of like maybe that famous President's Daily Brief, the PDB that went to President Bush in the summer of 2001, and as we can talk about perhaps later, still didn't actually have much effect. And then one other argument there, a guy named Mitch Silber, maybe you've seen some of his work, a former New York Police Department senior intelligence analyst. He's argued, I think, a good point, that it was more a failure of analysis than collection. The information was there, the sheer threat warning was there, but it wasn't put together. And there have been official reports, such as from the DHS Inspector General and a report by a Senate committee, making much the same argument. But maybe it wasn't an intelligence failure, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion. A number of experts have said, no, you really can't call it an intelligence failure because there was a lot of intelligence warning that really predicted what happened. Some of those arguments have come from the inside. You might kind of expect it, such as from the acting intelligence director for the Capitol Police, who said after January 6th that, hey, we provided the information, we did an excellent job. And Michael, as many of the people on the call probably have seen, you have argued very well, I think, that many agencies provided multiple warning reports, and how can you really call that an intelligence failure? But where I come at this is, I think that is a little bit similar to the arguments that George Tenet, the CIA director before and after 9/11, George Tenet made about that question of intelligence failure on 9/11. He argued, and he again made a good statement of this point, that an intelligence failure would mean that we weren't focused on the problem. We weren't paying attention. We didn't produce the sorts of warnings that you might expect. And we did all of that on 9/11. And I just don't accept that, because I think that there is much more to what went on that really needs to be called an intelligence failure. Because when intelligence isn't used properly, it can be a failure both of the policymakers, and maybe we should just call this a failure of policy, but I think there's more to it, because I don't think intelligence did enough. This question of what to define something, when to define something as an intelligence failure is kind of like asking where to set the goalposts. Is it enough for intelligence merely to have warned once, such as with the coronavirus, the global pandemic? As we know, intelligence agencies, health officials warned about a global pandemic. Is that enough to sort of absolve them from any sort of responsibility? I don't think so. In fact, one of my fellow faculty members here at the Naval Postgraduate School, Professor Jim Wirtz, has termed the first law of intelligence failure to be that I think we all probably recognize in our own lives and understanding of this issue, that after something bad happens, we can always find there was warning. But how much intelligence is enough to mean that intelligence did everything they can? And my argument is it's not enough for intelligence just to have warned, especially when warnings are mostly of sort of the big picture, strategic, long-range warnings. My research into intelligence failure and intelligence success, and we can talk about that too. There have been cases of intelligence success, certainly, that we know about and can talk about. But usually these big picture warnings, strategic intelligence warnings, these are almost of no use at all in preventing bad things from happening for many reasons, including that decision makers just don't tend to take action based on these big picture warnings. If you come to a mayor, a governor, a president, a department secretary and say, hey, we're thinking something bad might happen, they're going to say, well, okay, but I've got lots of other things on my plate. Give me something specific. And so my model of how intelligence failure works and how intelligence success can happen, I think can help us understand what went on January 6th. In order to prevent disaster, we need two things. First, very specific intelligence and warning, what typically in national security and military intelligence we call tactical intelligence. And the second thing is that we need decision makers who understand intelligence, they're familiar with it, and they are ready to act on it. And I call that intelligence receptivity. I believe that before January 6th, we had a lot of that tactical intelligence, certainly through social media, but we lacked receptivity. We lacked decision makers who are willing to take action. And why that happened is a question that we still need to think about. And I'll just offer a couple of more thoughts to this, and then we can go and talk about this a little bit. Part of the problem before 9/11 was that the intelligence picture was very cloudy, but this always happens. We're trained in military decision-making, military intelligence, that decision makers have to be able to make decisions even when they don't understand the big picture. But just one example of how this picture, depending on where you look, it could look like intelligence did a great job or not so great a job. What has become a famous report that the Capitol Police Intelligence Service put out on January 3rd said, and you may not be able to read what I've circled there on the report here, it said that Congress itself may be the target on January 6th. Well, I don't know what else you can do than that, except that phrase, this clip, in fact, came out in the Washington Post. That phrase was on page 13 of a very long report. And if, like most decision makers, you just read the first page, you'd read a much more sort of milder assessment of what might be happening a few days from now on January 6th. Another big problem, of course, and I'm looking forward to talking about this, is that much of the warning came in the form of social media posts and other types of speech and expression by Americans and American citizens that could be certainly considered First Amendment protected speech. How do we monitor that? We don't have our act together as a country about that. January 6th showed that. Is it necessary surveillance for DHS and FBI to be monitoring social media? Or is this monitoring free speech? And in fact, DHS's intelligence organization had been criticized very strongly after the summer of 2020, when there had been a lot of unrest and riots in Portland, Oregon, and they had done an awful lot to monitor those groups that were protesting, and they were criticized and told to knock it off. And in fact, a lot of analysts at DHS and in the FBI saw the danger coming, but they didn't think, or at least they weren't sure, that the reports they were seeing, the information they were gathering met the specific criteria that they have for what they can report on. In many cases, and here these are texts back and forth between open source collectors, the analysts, the collectors at DHS Intelligence Analysis on January 2nd, January 3rd, and there are many of these that have been reported in the official after action reports that said, hey, we see a lot going on. There are people who are posting maps of the exits and entrances to the Capitol building. They're talking about bringing weapons. They're talking about doing whatever it takes to stop the count. What should we do about this? Well, yeah, and they said, this is really bad, but don't think we can talk about it. We can't report on it because this is First Amendment protected speech. So let me just finish up for the moment here and toss out a couple of ideas of what we should do now about this. First, I think we really need an official, internal, classified level investigation of the intelligence aspects of January 6th. So far, it doesn't look like we're getting that from the January 6th committee on the Hill, although we hear that some of the staffers with the committee are working on this problem. But even bigger, we need to understand, sort of get our arms around in this country what intelligence agencies can and can't do, should and shouldn't do about social media and other open source intelligence. And it really comes down to what kind of intelligence system do we want in America? My last comment is that I've talked to a number of analysts and officials at DHS Intelligence and other agencies that monitor domestic threats, and they argue that we have the kind of domestic intelligence system that America wanted. And essentially what I take from that is on January 6th, we got the result that we wanted because we wanted to put a lot of restrictions on domestic intelligence gathering, and those restrictions in part led to January 6th. Let me leave it at that, Michael. I'll stop sharing and look forward to talking with you. Here we go.
Great, thanks. That was compelling. I mean, there's a lot of food for thought there. I certainly think that you're raising a lot of important questions, and especially about, one thing that struck me, reading about after, it's like, who knew that the Capitol Police had their own intelligence? And they were operating 24/7 before this. They were they were on a round the clock watch. So there was a lot of, yes, there was awful lot of people doing reporting and throwing reports out there. Part of the question was, well, how much do you need, right? How much warning do you need on this to make a decision on what we need to do on security, right? Okay, so one of the things I'd like to ask about is then customer receptivity. So we both know the apocryphal story about Dr. Kissinger and, you told me, you didn't persuade me. So it's too good not to be true, right? But what about that? Is this a case of, was this really a failure to persuade more than a failure to tell the story?
Yeah, that's a great point, a great question. And just really briefly, I love that story about Kissinger. As you say, maybe it's not quite true, but it expresses this dilemma here. That was where back when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, he was National Security Advisor as well. He once learned when he received his version of the president's daily brief that a coup attempt had happened in some place, let's call it Upper Slovovia, someplace. And he said, imagine, he said it in a thick German accent, he said, wait a minute, you're telling me now a coup attempt happened? You got to tell me ahead of time, what do we pay you guys? This was the CIA managing the PDB process back then. What do we pay you guys for? His PDB briefer expected that, knew him, and said, well, yes, Mr. Secretary, let me pull out show you the briefing that we gave you on Tuesday, where we had an item that warned that there might be a coup attempt in Upper Slovovia. Henry Kissinger shook his head, tossed the briefing slides down on his desk and said, well, harumph, you may have warned me, but you didn't convince me.
Right.
And intelligence insiders often tell that story to sort of make fun of Kissinger and make fun of decision makers, to say, hey, what can we do? Right. But I think there's more to it there. And of course, I have to, we have to realize I'm no longer working within the intelligence system. I still have one foot in as a DoD employee and all that, but it's easy for me to say, I guess, from the outside. But I think the point is that intelligence does need to push a little farther when they see something really serious going on, or something that they know their customer cares a lot about.
Mhm.
And if the customer doesn't seem to be paying attention, it's up to intelligence to push a little harder. And we saw that at work, for instance. I've talked about this in my book on intelligence failure, 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, that back, for instance, after Pearl Harbor, before the Battle of Midway, when US Navy leaders weren't interested in hearing about possible Japanese attack coming up on the little tiny island of Midway, the naval intelligence personnel in Hawaii, they thought this was really a big deal, and they tried to push, and eventually they convinced Admiral Nimitz to pay more attention, to look at the intelligence, and the result was a tremendous success for the US Navy and for naval intelligence. And we didn't see that pushback before January 6th. We also didn't see that in other cases, such as the coronavirus pandemic.
Right. One, by the way, I had a specific question, and this, maybe you can clear this up, because one of the things that one of the exhibits, of like the of the warning was this report from the FBI field office in Norfolk, and I wasn't familiar with the vehicle, this reporting. I wasn't really, I never seen that type of report myself. And I wondered if this was their version of ops traffic or something, and would that naturally be something that would get into the mainstream intelligence from FBI? You see what I mean? You see what I'm asking?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you know? I'm not sure.
That's right. And that report, that's again part of what we've now learned. We hadn't known about these sorts of things, and most of these sorts of reports that are put out by the FBI and DHS are if not classified, they're restricted for official use only. So we're starting to see some of those come out now officially. But that was a very tactical information report. They called it an SIR, a SEER, and when the DHS and FBI intelligence officials have been asked about that in testimony on the Hill ever since January 6th, they're asked about that. Why did FBI senior officials not get that? They said, well, because that's not intended for us. That is, just as you say, Michael, in military intelligence. I mean, that's sort of the raw data that goes into the maw of the intelligence system. And what the real point is that as a number of bodies have investigated this, have argued, inspector generals, GAO, Government Accountability Office, and others, that's why either the FBI or the DHS or both should have, the argument is made, should have put out a more general assessment. They should have put this information together and then come to senior officials and said, we're getting all this reporting, this is what it means. And sort of the argument that, for instance, I mentioned the former NYPD intelligence officer, Silber has argued, I think he's got a good point. He and others have argued that what instead happened was sort of like the equivalent of before Pearl Harbor. If a few days before December 7th, if naval intelligence had put out a report saying, well, we're getting a bunch of reports that the Japanese fleet may be operating 500 nautical miles north of Hawaii. And in other news, we're also seeing reports on new, banana prices in Central America or something like that. You've got to tell the decision maker what it means or what it might mean, and that didn't happen.
Right. And by the way, I read I was reading recently about Pearl Harbor. You're an expert, I'm sure, former naval intelligence, but that, in fact, Admiral Leahy raised this after the Battle of Taranto and said, hey, how vulnerable are we at Pearl Harbor on this? We just saw a very successful torpedo attack against the fleet by the British against the Italians. And so are we, he made the obvious, and he connected point A with point B and said, what are we going to, what about us in Pearl Harbor? And that just sort of went.
That's right.
That went away. Nobody really took any action on this. This was from Admiral Leahy.
That's right. And there were a number of such reports before Pearl Harbor on just the threat that
Right.
developed. There were war games exercises that argued that we know there's going to be a war
Right,
coming in the
of course,
Pacific,
of course.
and we think it's going to start with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. But the
Right.
problem is, and this gets to this issue of strategic intelligence, strategic warning versus more tactical specific. What I believe this shows is that those sorts of big picture warnings, essentially that's somebody who matters saying, hey, this might happen someday. Decision makers don't take action when somebody comes to them and says, this might happen. Somebody might use airplanes. Al-Qaeda might use airplanes to attack buildings. There were warnings before 9/11 about that specific threat, but nobody had the specifics inside the threat. Nobody had the information, even though it was starting to come clear, but nobody had the information that these people operating within the United States had a plot to actually do that. That would have been tactical intelligence, tactical warning. Same thing. We had a lot of those pieces of information before January 6th, but it wasn't put together in a way decision makers could use.
Let's go further than that. Talking about your slide where all these different organizations. Who knew, right? Park Police have their intelligence, right? I mean it's an extraordinary thing. But we have, one of the things that jumps out at you as you look at all of that, DHS, FBI, et cetera. It's not intelligence is not the main mission of any of them. And so domestic intelligence is just something they also do. I mean, DHS is an enormous organization, also does domestic intelligence. FBI, I mean, has lots of different things that it's responsible for. Richard Posner wrote a book about domestic intelligence a few years ago, discussing do we need something like the British MI5, where an organization just dedicated to domestic intelligence, but not an arrest authority, but just looking at it from an intelligence point of view. Is this part, is this part of the problem that we just have too many institutions that are looking at it, but not one institution that really has overall authority?
I think that's a discussion that's worth having, but frankly, I can't see this country ever deciding that we're going to create a new, large, expensive intelligence bureaucracy without something happening on the scale of 9/11. January 6th just wasn't enough for it. And we had this discussion in this country in the years after 9/11 about whether to set up some version of the British MI5. As you say, that's the domestic intelligence service, as opposed to MI6, the James Bond, the cool guys. And the problem is that even in the more than 20 years after 9/11, most of the American intelligence community has still been focused overseas. Even on the problem of terrorism, the focus is on external, on groups, actors such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And as that problem is still there, definitely, but as that problem has been overtaken by domestic extremists, by plots, plans, terrible things done by people within the United States, as I say, we just don't have our arms around that, because the only two organizations that in our national intelligence community that have specific missions relating to domestic intelligence are DHS, as you say, their organization. They don't do law enforcement. Their intelligence organization has often been sort of accused or made fun of as not really being one of the big boys. And then the FBI. And the FBI, for its credit, they have been focused on domestic extremism for years, but they still are primarily a law enforcement organization. They're guys and gals with guns and badges who catch the bad guys after the fact. And what I would actually like to see a new domestic intelligence organization with all the right ethics, laws, oversight. I just can't see that ever happening.
Especially when you have so much capacity now that doesn't appear, frankly, it doesn't appear necessarily like it's getting used. Because you have something like 80 fusion centers in the US, right? Just that alone. And not to mention all the JADFs that we have, just focused on terrorism, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of capacity in the US right now. Anyway, let me ask it, and then we'll get to questions from the group. But I think one of the things that you raised and was on surveillance. And I think something extraordinary part of this story is how hundreds of people have been tracked down and charged with various crimes or misdemeanors associated with January 6th via surveillance cameras or what have you. I mean, can maybe comment a little more on that? Because I mean, I think that's been quite an amazing element to this. It's not slightly scary, right? Because I mean, there's a lot of surveillance even available to the public on this.
That's right. And really, these are important issues that I think we need to have a better discussion, a better informed discussion about in this country. Just how much do we want our agencies at the federal level, at the state and local level, our law enforcement agencies to do this way? But just as one example, this came out in the press and in the paperwork filed in the DC and federal court system. But for instance, the FBI was able to track down one guy who had broken into the Capitol, even though he had tried to be kind of careful. He had used what we might call good operations security, OPSEC. He had turned his phone off, and he had carried his mother's cell phone as he broke into the Capitol. A little bit funny there. I don't know how many.
Nice thing to do.
Yep. I don't know how many serious bad guys use their mother's cell phone, but it didn't get clear him. The FBI ended up getting 2 separate tips from the public about it, and that's a big part of it. The old see something, say something. It actually leads to something. Checking my notes on this. They were able to find surveillance video of him going through one of the broken windows. They compared his face, this facial recognition, with a passport application that he had put in a couple of years before. And even more interesting, they found a clip on YouTube when he had gotten into a fight at a bar, and he was wearing the same jacket that he wore breaking into the Capitol. Pro tip: get new clothes when you're going to break lots of federal laws. They then got a search warrant, so legal, through Verizon to have his cell phone tracked. And even though he'd had it off when he went into the building, it was tracked, plotted right up to the Capitol. And then the last thing they did, they used license plate recognition data, LPR data, another one of these tools that law enforcement is using in this country and around the world. And they were able to track his car driving from New York to DC. Had left New York the night before and was last tracked near the Capitol at about 2 a.m. the morning before the attack on the Capitol. And so question is it good that our federal government has all these ways to track us because they can track down bad guys? Or is that a problem? Are we uncomfortable with being able to be tracked by so many different tools?
Right. Let me great. And obviously we could just spend all our time talking about that. Let's invite some questions from our guests. And one, Bruce, I'm going to summarize this a little bit. I mean, we kind of raised this early on about, how much, and I guess this goes back to my point that I had made in the article, was how much warning did they need? There was a lot, not just intelligence reporting, but also plenty of media reporting, open source reporting that was suggesting, as Bruce says, it will be wild, right? I mean, it was going to be, it was going to be an interesting day. So was this, Erik, was this, how much should we be putting on basically the security decision makers and not using common sense on this? There was some, and I'll just add to that just a little quip I remember from reading, I think it was the Senate staff report, where Senator Leahy asked Chief Sund, how much did you need?
You're right. And as you know, and our audience probably knows, the DC or the Capitol Police Chief, who later left that job after January 6th, but he has testified and he stated publicly that he doesn't feel he got enough intelligence, and
right.
He got these sorts of scattered warnings. But again, as we talked about before, every one of these warnings comes with a sort of a caveat that, well, of course, this is just social media. And after all, as our FBI and DHS intelligence officials have testified afterward, on social media, people sound kooky all the time. They say crazy things all the time. And if we are going to end up spending a lot of taxpayer money, revving the system up, maybe even arresting or monitoring American citizens. Every time somebody says something nutty, I'm going to be out of a job soon because I'll get fired, is what they've said. But I think it's a reasonable point to argue that none of these intelligence agencies put this information together into what you might call an assessment, sort of a product that could be used, and none of them pushed back a little bit more if they didn't see anything going on in planning, such as we've seen since the Capitol Police planning documents. And of course, our law enforcement, they do a great job of planning for these sorts of things. That's a big part of what law enforcement agencies do. But in their planning documents, just put out on January 5th, used on the morning of January 6th, those planning documents said things such as, we don't expect any more problems than normal. We deal with big demonstrations in DC all the time, so we don't see something coming. And it seems hard now. Of course, we're after the fact, 2020 hindsight. You and I weren't there. I recognize all that, but it seems hard to believe that none of the senior officials in charge had in the back of their minds thinking, wait a minute, why are these people talking about using tunnels to break into the Capitol? Why are people talking about attacking members of Congress? Should we do something more about it? And they didn't.
Right, and there was apparent, there was a lot of backstory, of course, being all the sensitivity to response to the riots in the city back in May, the year before, and Portland, and feeling right, which you had mentioned earlier. Okay, so another question, you raised this earlier, that let me see if I get this right from our viewer here, is the distance, the groups that were seem to be farther away from the problem seem to have done a better job, perhaps, in assessing it. Can you elaborate a little more on that? How do we sort of get over that problem?
Yeah, I think partly this is something that we've seen in broader literature and work on decision making, on everything from foreign policy to domestic policy. As you may have seen, you may be familiar with the argument that often experts are not the best people to be able to anticipate, understand threats to their area of expertise. And that's often because experts are so ingrained in understanding what happened that they can't understand that something might change that. So I think this is a case where that happened. The Secret Service lead officials, the Capitol Police lead officials who had the job of protecting all of those senior officials in the Capitol on January 6th, they just couldn't see that something could happen that was completely different from whatever has happened. And it reminds me of my own experience when I've had that problem back a long time ago. You and I remember back during the Cold War, for instance, when I was a young intelligence officer in Germany watching the Soviet, and I found that when something unusual happened with the Soviet military, I usually would not make my first call to one of our longest in the tooth, most experienced analysts, because they would say, for instance, one time when unusual air activity, should we worry about this? Should I wake anybody up? It was 2 a.m. When I called one of our most experienced analysts who'd been there for years, a civilian analyst, and he said, hey, you didn't need to wake me up about this because that happened back in '74. And I think I remember in March of '68, the Soviets did that too. So, now not to worry about it. But if we had asked someone who didn't know so much about the history, who wasn't so ingrained, I might have said, whoa, that's really unusual. Maybe we should pull that string a little bit more. And I just wish that somebody had done that before January 6th. Said, wait a minute, I'm not sure we've ever seen this volume of reporting. Maybe we need to pull that string and do more about it.
Right, looking for the discontinuities, being able to spot that type of just anomalies, right? Of course, okay. And I think there's another question we have here is, What about, is there a question here about collaboration between the public and private sector to prevent these things? So, I mean, we've got a lot of, we've seen this, we saw it, I think, somewhat in this event, right? Because there were private security firms looking at social media and raising some warnings. And I think we've been seeing this a lot lately on other areas of security problems. How can we get better collaboration between the private and the public sector on intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly we did see before January 6th, a lot of the warnings that came from private individuals, but also private organizations, some private intelligence and security organizations, such as the SITE group, SITE, that monitors social media and extremism, other groups that were reporting on these sorts of things. And our domestic intelligence system does do a lot of work with those private organizations, especially at the state and local level. You mentioned earlier that we have now 80 what are called intelligence fusion centers around the country, all been established since 9/11. And most of them have good relationships with private business organizations in their communities. And you can imagine in Las Vegas, for instance, the Las Vegas Fusion Center needs to work closely with the big hotels and casinos, which have themselves very sophisticated tools for intelligence collection and threat assessment here. But that didn't do enough. And one last point on that one, in fact, we don't know everything that DHS and the FBI are doing now to try to adapt better to the next threat. But what we have heard and what they've testified about includes more extensive use of some of these private organizations and things like algorithms for big data, for tracking social media. Often those tools are actually owned and managed by private companies. So DHS, the FBI, we believe they're buying more of these products. And part of the thinking is some reporting last year from the DHS announced that they were going to be making more use of these private services that do sort of big data collection on social media and other open source data to try to determine threat levels. But they explained that this would be okay and wouldn't violate ethics, wouldn't violate domestic intelligence laws, because one, these would be private companies, not DHS doing it. And second, they would only be providing to DHS sort of aggregated data, not individuals about what you posted or what I posted, but just sort of assessments. Maybe that's a way forward, but I'm a little concerned when we turn over our domestic security more and more to private companies, because they aren't subject to the same levels of oversight as our government agencies are at whatever level of government.
No, I mean, they have, I think there's issues with that. There's some things that could be good. But if you're making your living off finding threats, it may not, there may be some issues with that too. Okay, so let me see if we can get to this question. Bob asks, can we parse receptivity more finely? Is there a difference in your mind between convince and persuade, for example? Is it incumbent upon analysts to persuade decision makers to act more than to convince them? In other words, to change their belief. What do you think about that?
That's a great point. And I think and here a lot of intelligence insiders, a lot of serving intelligence officials disagree with me. And I've been told that a lot, and that's perfectly understandable. And again, I'm not, and I don't have this job myself, but I believe that our history, the track record of intelligence in preventing bad things from happening and in failing to do that, shows that intelligence does need to have part of a mission to persuade, not to make decisions for decision makers, obviously. Just as in the military, we have a very distinct line between the intelligence support that somebody like me used to provide and the decisions made by operators, maybe lower level tactical or very senior level. But as I was told once early on in my intelligence career, I said, every intelligence officer has room for one yes, but. The idea is if Michael, I'm briefing you and you don't seem to be, paying attention, you're not getting it, and you say, okay, good enough, that's all I need to know. I can say once anyway, I can say, yes, sir, but let me just restate this. Now, that's about as far as I can go. And that didn't happen before January 6th. It didn't happen before the coronavirus pandemic either. And it didn't happen in other cases of failure.
I was thinking, when you were saying that, like, where is, so there was no August 6th, 2001 PDB, analogously.
That's right.
On this, right? That kind of in 1 page or 1.5 pages, put all this together, and here you go, Mr. Policymaker. This is what we've got.
That's right. And
right.
And again, though, to go back to history, but that's what we know is what has happened in the past. Just to mention again the example from Pearl Harbor, and to that point that the viewer asked about, a very specific example there of how when intelligence pushes back, it can work. That Admiral Nimitz, who was a very big sport of intelligence, in fact, he did not fire any of the senior intelligence officers in Hawaii when he came in after Pearl Harbor and took charge, because he believed they did the best they could. But when they came to him about intelligence regarding a Japanese attack on Midway, he said, sorry, I got too much else on my plate. You just carry on. And the senior intelligence officer for Admiral Nimitz told him specifically, he said, sir, it's not enough for you to tell me that, you heard me and you're just going to go about your job. I need to convince you. This gets back to that Henry Kissinger story. And here's where it really happened. And Admiral Nimitz finally said, okay, I don't have the time to listen to you, but I'm going to send one of my senior staff officers. And that senior staff officer spent hours with the intelligence folks in their equivalent of what we call a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented intelligence facility, looking at all the data. And when that senior staff officer was convinced, he could then convince Admiral Nimitz to listen to intelligence. That never happened here before January 6th.
Right. Okay. I'm going to try to summarize this, and I think we've been addressing it, but what factors then encourage receptivity? If we don't think we answered this already, I think we've gotten, basically, how do we change a mental model or a mindset that a policymaker has on something like this?
Right. And that's, of course, that's the $1 million question. If I knew the answer, I'd probably be either selling it and making $1 million, or I'd be working for the government and doing lots of more work than a professor can do. But I think we have some of the answers already in the way we do our military and national security intelligence. That in my intelligence career, for instance, I was always assigned to work for and with operators, decision makers. In fact, in my basic intelligence training, I started out in the Navy going through officer candidate school along with future pilots who would be Navy pilots. We went through the same survival training out in the woods, we learning how to parachute and survive in the water. And the idea was that years down the road, when I came to one of those pilots who now has become a commanding officer of a squadron or more senior officer, and I said, boss, I think you need to pay attention to something, they're going to remember back and say, okay, I remember that Dahl guy, I'm gonna listen to him. And we don't have any sort of a training. In other words, the decision makers need to understand intelligence and get to know their intelligence officers. We don't have anything like that in the civilian domestic system. Do governors go through any sort of a training program so they understand intelligence? Do other leaders, especially at the local level, understand intelligence unless they've happened to work in it? Not necessarily.
Right. And in fact, the questions that came up and some of the points I think that the Chief Sund was making suggested to me that maybe you have too high an expectation for what intelligence can deliver to you on something like this. It's a realm of ambiguity, so you may not get the type of specificity you're looking for.
Yep. Well, One other quick, I call it a C story, even though this wasn't a C story, but another example of how these things can work in the military intelligence world. Colin Powell, for instance, General Colin Powell, one of our most esteemed military leaders back during the first Gulf War, his senior intelligence officer happened to be a naval intelligence officer, Admiral Mike McConnell. And one time when Colin Powell later told this story, he said one time when he was debating something about the first Gulf War and what to do, he was starting to think about something, and Admiral McConnell, his intelligence officer, reached across the table in their conference room and said, "Sir, here's a report on what you're thinking about. And some options for you." And General Powell said to Admiral McConnell, "Wait a minute, how did you have this report? How do you know I was thinking about whether we should make a left hook or whatever it is? Because I only thought of it now." And Admiral McConnell said, "Yes, sir, but I sit in every one of your meetings. I spend 12 hours a day with you, and you've been making aside comments about that sort of a thing for the last couple of days, sounding as if you were interested in that. So I had our people work on it last night." And that's what they came up with. We don't have any sort of a close relationship between intelligence and policy like that on the civilian side, and we need it.
Right. Well, yeah, a shared experience like you have with, okay. I think there's a few more questions here. We'll try to get them in before the top of the hour. How should assessment products be tailored to garner attention of agency leadership? What specific elements must be present to take them seriously?
Hey, that's a great point. And part of the answer is, and it may sound like I'm deflecting here, but it's whatever works for that decision maker or that operator. Famously during Ronald Reagan's presidency, the CIA knew that President Reagan liked to see visual things, so they produced video clips, video intelligence reports. So we need to be taking that into account. But also, you need to have that bottom line up front. You need to have an assessment that says this is what is serious about it, and that's what we didn't have, for instance, in that that January 3rd report from the Capitol Police Intelligence Organization that said on page 13, hey, the Capitol itself is going to be the target on January 6th. They didn't. Nobody's going to read until page 13 of that. So you got a bottom line up front. We train that all the time. When we do policy memos, those sorts of things.
What practical advice to convey actionable threat intelligence to policymakers would you have? Besides some of the things that you mentioned just now, is there more than you can say about that?
Well, in a way, sort of that means what makes actionable intelligence, and how can we get policymakers to listen? And again, policymakers make the decision, but we need to be able to provide that specific tactical level intelligence about a specific threat. Again, strategic warnings don't work. Just to say, hey boss, I think maybe this might happen. Nobody's going to do that. You need to bring some specific intelligence, but then put it in context, what this means, and possibly even think about offering suggestions for what decision makers should do. Although usually intelligence doesn't do that.
Finally, I think this is a good way to wrap up, because we're coming to the end of the hour here. But what your project on COVID? How is it different from what you were writing about before? What did it? You're writing about intelligence failure, but did you discover anything new out of this new research?
Yes, and in fact, maybe later you'll invite me back and we can talk about that more specifically. I'm afraid I found that the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic was an intelligence failure, much as January 6th was, in the sense, and it really in the same ways. We all had warnings before the pandemic, before December of 2019. Intelligence community, the directors of national intelligence, the CDC, the World Health Organization, experts, people really interested in public health, like Bill Gates, have been warning for years about the threat of a global pandemic. But decision makers don't take action when you just say, hey, boss, we might have a global pandemic someday. I would like you to spend a couple $2 billion on that. What we needed was to have developed, and we didn't have that. We didn't have the public health surveillance tools available and the more traditional intelligence tools available as well. Human intelligence, signals intelligence, that could have gotten early warning about the outbreak in China. The first thing that the West learned the first time that we learned in the United States about this outbreak was on December 30th, after it had been circulating for a while in China already. We needed to have earlier warning and then be able to track it in the US even better today. So we still aren't ready for the next pandemic. But again, that's my next book.
Good. Well, and we look forward to talking more about it. We hope, get you back soon for another excellent discussion on this. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thanks for the great questions. This is a really important topic. I hope you continue to write about it. And Erik, and thanks for really delivering on a very stimulating presentation and discussion today.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for everybody. Really enjoyed it. Bye.
Right, bye, everybody. And next month, we'll be having a talk on Iran. Where do we go from here? With former case officer Scott Modell, who is currently at the Rapidan Group in Washington, D.C. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody on that. I think that's August 10th. So we'll look forward to that. And until that next time, goodbye.